Her son declared her mentally unfit, in open court, with his wife nodding beside him. Helen Dorsey, retired civil engineer and stroke survivor, didn't flinch. By the end of the month, she'd own the building where his law office sat, and the locks he assumed were his. He'd called her compromised. She called a contractor. His name stayed on nothing. Not the trust, not the deed, not even the mailbox. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the rent. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The fluorescent lights above the courtroom hummed like distant static. Helen Dorsey sat with her hands folded neatly in her lap, the sleeves of her blazer brushing the cheap upholstery of the witness pew. Her hearing aid caught every word her son said, every syllable, crisp and condescending. "She's not confused, Your Honor," Aaron said, the edge of practiced patience in his voice. "She's compromised. The stroke, while mild, has had observable impacts on her executive function, decision-making, financial comprehension, short-term memory." He turned toward the judge, the corners of his mouth lifting in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not making this claim lightly. My only concern is for her well-being and the integrity of my late father's estate." Helen's pen tapped against her legal pad once, then again, deliberate, rhythmic, the same rhythm she'd used to chart bridge load intervals back when her name still sat on blueprints for state-funded infrastructure. She didn't look at Aaron. She stared at Judge Ramirez. The judge leaned back slightly, thumb pressed to her temple. "Ms. Dorsey, given the claims presented and the pending probate motion, I'm ordering a full capacity review before we proceed further. This is not a ruling against you, but a matter of due diligence." Helen said nothing. She nodded once and wrote slowly across her legal pad, "Due diligence requires honesty. Start there." Cynthia, her daughter-in-law, sat still as stone beside Aaron, a neat stack of compliance documents perched on her lap like a shield. Her eyes remained fixed on the tabletop. When the court adjourned, she rose without a word and followed Aaron out the side exit, heels echoing in hollow clacks against the linoleum floor. Grace was already waiting in the hall. "I brought your coat," she said, slipping the navy wool over Helen's shoulders like she was easing a museum piece into preservation. Helen didn't speak until they'd passed through the courthouse's heavy glass doors and onto the wide front steps. The Minnesota wind bit at her ears, sharp and familiar. "I counted," Helen said. Her voice was even. He used the word unstable 3 times, but not once did he say I was lying. Grace's mouth pressed into a line. She looped her arm under Helen's. "I could have slapped the smirk off him with a paperback." Down the steps they went, each one slow but measured. Helen's gait had changed since the stroke, but not her spine, not the posture she'd earned from decades of standing over structural load diagrams and city planners who talked down to her. She walked as if her dignity weighed nothing. "Did you see the way she avoided my eyes?" Helen asked softly. "Cynthia?" Grace replied. "Guilt isn't heavy till it lands. She's still floating." They reached the curb where Grace's tan Subaru waited. Helen stopped before opening the passenger door and looked up at the city skyline, gray office towers spearing the horizon, dotted with leased names. Downtown St. Paul was a box of secrets stacked in glass. Her son's office, somewhere up there, was just one more she was going to unpack. She didn't wait to get inside. She pulled her phone from her coat pocket with fingers that no longer trembled. The screen glared against the afternoon light as she scrolled to her contacts. Her thumb hovered for only a second. Then she tapped. "Dr. Levinson's office," the receptionist answered. Helen drew in a breath. "I need a full neuropsychological assessment. Executive function, memory, judgment, the works." There was a pause. "May I ask who referred you?" "No one," Helen said, "but you'll want my name spelled correctly. It'll be going on the report." As Grace pulled away from the courthouse curb, the silence between them was thick but alive. Outside, traffic idled at the lights. Inside, Helen stared out the passenger window, the corner of her legal pad peeking from her purse. She tapped it once, thoughtfully. "Grace?" "Yeah?" "I want documentation. Not just clearance, documentation." "You'll get it," Grace said, signaling left. But what for exactly? Helen's eyes didn't leave the skyline. To speak, she said quietly, then louder as if the city needed to hear it too. Next time I won't be silent. The room smelled like alcohol wipes and old carpet, clean but tired. Helen sat upright in the faux leather chair, legs crossed at the ankle, palms resting flat on her lap. Across from her, Dr. Mara Levinson flipped the last page of Helen's intake questionnaire and looked up with a patient, clinical curiosity. "Before we begin," she said, voice even but not unkind, "is there anything you want me to know about your situation?" Helen met her eyes without hesitation. "Only that I've been underestimated before. It tends to end badly for the other party." Dr. Levinson smiled faintly. "Fair enough." The test began with a simple sentence. "Repeat after me. No ifs, ands, or buts." Helen didn't just repeat it. She wrote it down in all caps, with even spacing. She even underlined buts. "Memory check," the doctor murmured, making a notation. It continued. Sequences, pattern recognition, emotional reasoning. One card showed a cartoon man weeping at a train station. "What's happening in this picture?" the doctor asked. Helen didn't glance twice. "He missed the train, probably one that mattered, either a funeral or a second chance." Then, coolly, "The good ones usually come too early or too late." A beat of silence, then a pen scratching the clipboard. They tested verbal fluency. Helen was asked to name as many animals as she could in 60 seconds. She offered armadillo, kestrel, possum, narwhal. At 30 seconds in, Dr. Levinson raised an eyebrow. "Most people say dog first." "I'm not most people." The final portion was logic-based, hypothetical planning, risk assessment. If someone offered to pay you $50 now or $100 in a month, which would you take? Helen raised a brow. "Depends on who's offering. If it's my son, I'd take the $50, because he'd find a way to tax the 100. Dr. Levinson laughed softly, then caught herself. "I appreciate the realism." The test ended with a tracing exercise. Helen's pen didn't shake once. Her grip was firm. Engineer's hands, still wired for precision even after the stroke. When she finished, she handed the clipboard back with the kind of stillness that comes from decades of meetings where people assumed she was the assistant. "I'll compile the results tonight," Dr. Levinson said, "but Ms. Dorsey—" She folded her glasses into her palm and looked up. "You're as lucid as any expert I know." "I'd like it in writing," Helen replied, "and notarized." A pause, then a nod. That evening, Grace met her in the dining nook that doubled as Helen's home office. The printer hummed while Helen fed through tab dividers labeled memory, reasoning, executive judgment, and signature pages. A slim black binder snapped shut with a finality that felt like steel doors closing. The front label read, "Fit to Testify." Grace held it in her hands, thumbing the edge. "You sure you want to walk back into that courtroom with this much heat?" Helen clicked a fresh pen closed. "Not walking, returning." The next morning, they visited the UPS store off Selby Avenue. Helen slid her legal documents into the envelope, added a second copy for her attorney, then took a moment before writing out the destination. She paused mid-address, pen hovering above the paper. "What's wrong?" Grace asked. Helen answered without looking up. "Aaron's office is on the second floor of a commercial strip near Wabasha and 9th. She tapped the pen once on the envelope, thoughtful. "The building's older. He likes modern glass, but he settled for brick and lease incentives." Grace raised an eyebrow. "You remember the whole listing spec?" Helen didn't answer that. She sealed the envelope and handed it over the counter. That afternoon, her phone rang as the snow began to fall soft and steady outside her front window. Her attorney's voice crackled through. "Helen, the court got the documentation. Ramirez reviewed it personally. You'll have your chance to speak next week." Helen's hand hovered above her armrest, steady as granite. "Thank you," she said. As she hung up, Grace appeared in the doorway, holding her phone like it was a secret. "You're not going to believe this," she said. Helen looked up, amused. "Try me." "A friend of mine who works for Anderson Realty says the building where Aaron leases." Grace stepped into the room. "It's being quietly listed for sale. Off-market. No signage." Helen leaned back, eyes narrowing, lips parting just slightly. "Well," she said, "that's interesting timing." The lobby of Lynn and Associates smelled faintly of lemon polish and ambition. Brass placards lined the wall like a resume in metal, and the receptionist didn't bother to ask who Helen was, just offered a tight smile and gestured toward the glass-walled conference room. Inside, Shannon Lynn stood in black slacks and a slate-gray blouse, already laying out printouts on the table with surgical precision. Her posture was precise, her nails were short, and her eyes flicked up the second Helen entered. "Ms. Dorsey," Shannon said, voice like tempered steel wrapped in silk. "You're early. I like that." "I figured this kind of conversation shouldn't be rushed." Shannon nodded once, then gestured toward a chair. "I pulled everything on the property you mentioned. It's a 6-unit commercial structure, built in 1959, upgraded HVAC in 2015. 2 law firms, 1 CPA, a physical therapist, a satellite insurance office, and," she turned over a sheet, Aaron Dorsey and Associates. Helen sat down slowly, setting her black leather notebook on the table. "So I wasn't imagining the address." "Nope. Suite 204, Shannon tapped her pen on the highlighted entry. "Mid-tier lease rate. He negotiated a decent deal 3 years ago. Lease is still active, but—" She flipped to the back page. "Renewal in 4 months. Helen looked at the photo of the exterior, brick facade, tired signage, a cracked corner in the front walkway. Familiar. Not remarkable. "Why's it being listed off-market?" she asked. "The owner's retiring and moving to Arizona, doesn't want the tenants panicking, wants a clean transaction, no drama." Shannon arched an eyebrow. "We can honor that." Helen leaned forward slightly. "Would it be possible to purchase through an LLC? Something without my name attached?" "Silent acquisition?" Shannon didn't hesitate. "Entirely doable. You'd form a holding company, something innocuous. We'd file under that. Transfer deed, issue tenant notifications after closing. No legal requirement to disclose the new owner's identity unless subpoenaed." "Perfect," Helen said, already flipping open her notebook. "I should tell you," Shannon added, leaning forward, "properties like this don't stay unlisted for long. Investors smell long-term tenants and underpriced square footage from a mile out. Then we won't waste time." That afternoon, Helen and Grace sat at the notary's office. A matte manila folder rested between them, labeled in Sharpie, HDR Holdings, LLC. Helen signed with her usual steady hand. Grace signed as witness. The notary raised an eyebrow at the name. "HDR?" Helen capped her pen. "My initials." With intent back at home, the check was already queued for wire transfer. Probate had released a partial disbursement last month, just enough to make things interesting. "I don't want to raise red flags with Aaron," Helen said as she typed in the routing information. "He'll hear about the building eventually, but not before I've signed the deed and reviewed every lease." Grace sipped her tea and smirked. "You're going to be his landlord." "I'll be their landlord," Helen corrected, clicking submit. "He's just part of the rent roll." 3 days later, Shannon texted, "Offer accepted. Final docs en route. Check your inbox." Helen printed every page. The purchase agreement was thick, bound with a clip. At the last page, just above the signature line, there was space. Too blank, too polite. Helen clicked her favorite pen, blue ink, thick point, and wrote a single line in her sharp, slanted hand. "Let's see how he likes paperwork." She signed beneath it with a full flourish. The bailiff called the courtroom to order, and the heavy wooden doors groaned open like a warning bell. Helen stepped inside with her back straight and her gaze forward, the soft thud of her sensible shoes echoing on the polished floor like a metronome of intention. Her navy blazer, perfectly pressed, caught the courtroom's fluorescent light just enough to gleam, but not enough to flash. She carried a slim black binder under one arm. Aaron didn't stand, but he did sit up straighter, smirking as he glanced toward the judge. His suit was tighter today, tailored to signal power, but something about his posture said he'd expected someone else to walk in. Someone smaller, slower, defeated. Helen reached the plaintiff's table without a single tremor in her gait. Her attorney, a younger man with a courtroom calm honed through probate warfare, slid the binder onto the table like he was placing evidence at a crime scene. Judge Ramirez leaned in. We've received updated documentation regarding Ms. Dorsey's cognitive evaluation. Aaron's face twitched, just once at the corner of his mouth, but he masked it quickly. The judge continued, Dr. Levinson's report finds Ms. Dorsey to be in full possession of her faculties and decision-making abilities. Helen didn't blink. She simply turned to face the room, expression unreadable, hands folded on the table like she was waiting for a city budget meeting to start. I'll allow testimony, Ramirez said. Ms. Dorsey, you may proceed. Aaron leaned back in his chair, legs crossed, pen tapping slowly against his notepad. Cynthia, beside him, kept her hands tucked neatly in her lap. She didn't look up. Helen stood. I'd like to clarify the timeline, she began, voice steady. My stroke occurred 8 months ago. Mild, transient. I was hospitalized for 2 days, followed by 6 weeks of occupational therapy and neuro rehab. At no point was I unconscious. At no point did I lose legal competency. She opened the binder. This, she turned to the judge, is a complete transcript of my capacity evaluation, notarized, time-stamped, and reviewed by a licensed clinical neuropsychologist. Ramirez gave a subtle nod. It will be entered into the record. Helen paused, allowing that moment to sit like a stone in a still lake. 2 weeks after my discharge, she continued, my son visited. He brought documents, told me they were temporary. Power of attorney, joint signatory updates, estate access in case something happened again. Aaron's pen stopped tapping. He said, and I quote, this is just until you're stable again, you're still foggy, and I can't risk the estate falling into dispute. Helen met the judge's gaze squarely. I wasn't foggy, I was recovering, and I wasn't told I had the option to wait, to consult another attorney, or to decline. I was manipulated. The room had gone so quiet, the air itself seemed to retreat. Helen's fingers tightened slightly on the binder's edge. He used my recovery as cover, and I let him because I assumed he still remembered how I raised him. Aaron finally moved, leaning forward, opening his mouth slightly, but Helen raised one hand. Not to silence him, but as punctuation. I'm not accusing him of theft, she said. Yet. But I am saying this. I've spent my life designing bridges to carry heavy weight. My mind knows the difference between load-bearing and collapse. And what he did? She looked right at Aaron. It was structural manipulation. Cynthia's breath hitched. She looked down so sharply her hair fell across her face, her hands pressed against her thighs. Helen sat slowly. The binder closed with a soft click. Judge Ramirez rubbed the bridge of her nose, then looked to Helen's attorney. Given the testimony and the documentation, I'm ordering a delay in ruling. The estate's financial records, especially those accessed under the power of attorney, will be reviewed for any irregularities. Aaron stiffened. Cynthia closed her eyes. Helen didn't look at either of them. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. The email came at 6:42 a.m. The subject line read, Deal closed, HDR Holdings, LLC. Helen clicked it before the kettle had even finished boiling. Attached were 12 PDFs, a summary spreadsheet, and a digital deed with her LLC's name typed in bold final font at the top. No fanfare, no champagne, just a timestamp and a quiet sense of arrival that settled into her chest like weight rediscovered. She hadn't outmaneuvered her son, not yet, but she had purchased the ground beneath his office. She poured her tea, carried her laptop to the breakfast table, and opened each lease one by one. The scent of Earl Grey mingled with faint printer ink as she began to print them out, page by meticulous page. 6 tenants, all locked into varying agreements. Most reasonable. One stood out, Aaron Dorsey and Associates, Suite 204. Lease term, 2 years. Commenced, June 1st, 2 years ago. End date, May 31st, 4 months from now. Clause 12.4, termination with 60-day notice permitted by landlord in event of material conflict of interest, structural renovation, or new management realignment. Helen uncapped her pen and drew a perfect circle around the clause, the blue ink soaking slightly into the thick contract paper. Then she smiled. It wasn't cruel, it was clinical, a recognition of symmetry. Grace arrived 30 minutes later, still wearing her oversized library sweatshirt and carrying a brown paper bag of almond croissants. "You check your email?" she asked, letting herself in. Helen held up the circled lease. "Guess who owns the locks now?" Grace dropped the bag and burst into laughter. "You know he's going to lose his mind." Helen sipped her tea. "Let him. He's had his hands in mine for long enough." They spread the documents across the kitchen table, sectioned by tenant. Helen used sticky tabs, color-coded by expiration date and special clauses. Grace poured 2 plastic cups of boxed wine at 11 in the morning and raised hers in salute. "To the landlord formerly known as Mom." Helen touched her cup to Grace's with a soft clink. "And to controlled environments." Later that afternoon, Helen called Shannon. The line picked up on the second ring. "Everything processed?" she asked. "Recorded with the county and finalized with title," Shannon confirmed. "You're officially the owner as of this morning. Want me to send out tenant notifications?" Helen paused. Then, "Yes. Draft them all. But I want Aaron's sent last." "Want to time it for effect?" Shannon asked, almost too casually. "I want it read after coffee but before lunch, right when he thinks he owns the day." Shannon laughed under her breath. "Understood. Should I list you as point of contact? Number, keep it under HDR Holdings for now, but make sure the signature line is mine. Full name, legible." At 10:47 a.m. the next day, Aaron received an email from the property manager's office. The subject line read, "Change in building ownership, Suite 204. Inside was a formal notification that the property was now owned and managed by HDR Holdings LLC, effective immediately. All lease terms remained intact unless renegotiated or terminated per clause 12.4. The bottom of the email included a scanned PDF with a signature, not a logo, not an alias. Helen M. Dorsey, Managing Director, HDR Holdings. In his downtown office, Aaron stared at the screen. His jaw tightened. His chair creaked beneath him. Outside his window, the wind stirred the brittle limbs of a tree stripped bare by winter. He read it again, then again. No mistake. His landlord was his mother. Helen opened her inbox over a second cup of coffee. There it was, time-stamped 9:03 a.m., marked high importance. The subject line, "Request for lease review, Suite 204. She clicked once. "Dear Ms. Dorsey, I've received notice of HDR Holdings' acquisition of the building where my law firm resides. As you are now listed as managing director, I would appreciate an updated rent schedule, clarification of any changes in policy, and your availability to discuss future lease renewal. Respectfully, Aaron Dorsey, Esquire." Dorsey and Associates. Helen stared at the screen for a moment, letting the weight of the words settle. Not what they said, but what they didn't. No, "Hi, Mom." No questions about her health. No apology. Just clipped, transactional diplomacy with a forced coat of polish. And one curious slip. "Ma'am," in the second line, where he must have auto-filled a generic greeting. He hadn't caught it before sending. She smiled faintly, took a sip of coffee, and typed exactly one word in reply. "Received." No signature, no follow-up, just a digital acknowledgement. Clean, surgical. Within the hour, Grace texted her a screenshot. "Cynthia just messaged me. Did she really do this?" I didn't respond. I figured silence is the new punctuation. Helen sent back a thumbs-up emoji, then went back to her spreadsheets. She spent the afternoon combing through the building's financials and lease comps. Shannon had already sent over average rental rates for similar office suites in the area. Downtown St. Paul's gentrification wasn't rapid, but it was steady, enough for modest escalation without raising red flags. Aaron was currently paying $1.87 per square foot, inclusive of utilities and parking. Below market. Below loyalty pricing even. The local average for professional suites of his size and amenities, $2.42 per square foot. Helen picked up her pen, drew a line down the margin of the rate sheet, and wrote 2 words in the space beside Aaron's rate. "Adjust upward." She didn't want him out. Not yet. That would end the tension too quickly. This wasn't about revenge in a blaze. It was erosion. Erosion disguised as policy. At 4:16 p.m., Shannon called. He emailed me too, she said, chuckling, tried to ask for flexibility due to long-standing tenancy. She paused. You've got to admire his nerve. He's always had nerve, Helen replied. He just forgot who helped him grow it. There was a pause on the line. Then Shannon asked almost cautiously, want to issue new rates across the board or just strategically? Strategically, Helen said. Everyone else stays where they are until end of term. Suite 204 gets a scheduled bump. Make it progressive, tied to minor improvement adjustments. You thinking paint? Lighting? Helen swirled the last of her tea and stared at her dining room ceiling. Number I'm thinking sound. Controlled disruption. Shannon let out a low whistle. You're colder than my last appraisal client. I'm thorough, Helen said, already reaching for her notebook. An hour later, with the windows open to let in the March chill, she sat with a yellow legal pad and wrote a to-do list. On the top of the page, Phase 2, Controlled Interference. Grace peeked in from the hallway, holding a tray of microwave popcorn. You hungry? I made snacks. War room rations. Helen tapped the pad. I need a contractor. For what? Minor upgrades, Helen said, smiling without showing her teeth, but scheduled just outside Aaron's windows, twice a week during calls. Grace raised an eyebrow. You're going to rattle him out of his own conference calls? Within city noise code, permitted hours. Helen folded the pad closed. Everything by the book. And she meant it. Not a single line outside the margins, just pressure applied precisely. She picked up the phone and scrolled to a number Shannon had included in her last email, Ray's Renovation and Commercial Design. Helen hit call. The line rang once. The first hammer strike landed at 8:03 a.m. sharp, right on schedule, right outside Suite 204. It echoed through the second floor of the building like a gavel on steel. Workers in neon vests hauled in drop cloths, ladder racks, and cans of commercial-grade primer. Dust curled into the hallway like an early warning system, the whir of drills, the whine of sanders, the low clatter of scaffolding wheels, each sound carefully orchestrated to dance around city code but still press on nerves. Helen stood 2 floors below in the main lobby, clipboard in hand, watching as the first coat of neutral slate went up on the hallway walls. Twice weekly, she reminded Ray, the lead contractor, who adjusted his tool belt and nodded. Tuesdays and Thursdays, between 8 and 11, not a minute past. Understood, he said, marking it down. Want the hallway sconces swapped too? Eventually, she said. Let the noise breathe a little first. On Thursday, Aaron emailed property management from Aaron Dorsey, Esquire, to Lynn and Associates Property Management subject, Disruption to Business Operations. This is a formal request to limit or reschedule the renovations currently underway. The noise has interrupted client calls, including 2 probate mediations. It feels targeted. Please confirm whether this activity is compliant with lease agreement and city code. Shannon forwarded it to Helen that afternoon with a 2-word message, Your move. Helen opened a fresh reply and typed slowly, All improvements are being made within permitted hours. Lease agreement permits common area enhancements at management discretion. Regards, Helen M. Dorsey, Managing Director, HDR Holdings. She didn't include an apology or a justification, just language clean enough to be hung in a courtroom. 3 days later, a knock came at Helen's door. She wasn't surprised to find Cynthia standing on the porch, arms crossed tight over a tailored wool coat. The wind whipped around them, biting through fabric. Helen gestured for her to come inside. Cynthia stepped into the warmth, blinking like she wasn't used to the lighting. I came alone, she said quickly, before Helen could ask. That says something, Helen replied, offering no hug, no smile, just a seat and a steaming pot of rooibos already steeping on the kitchen counter. Cynthia sat stiffly. Are you... She stopped, rubbed her fingers together. Are you doing this on purpose? Helen turned to pour 2 mugs. You'll have to be more specific. The construction, the noise, the rent change. You could have just talked to him. You're escalating this. Helen set a mug in front of her, then sat. So did he. You just didn't notice. Cynthia looked down, both hands wrapped around the cup she hadn't touched. He says this feels like revenge. Helen took a slow sip. Then he's finally paying attention. I don't know what you want from us anymore, Cynthia whispered. Helen didn't answer right away. The house was quiet except for the low tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I want, Helen said finally, the same thing I've always wanted, for him to know actions cost something. They sat in silence. After a long moment, Cynthia stood. I'll tell him you're not backing down. Helen nodded once. That's not new information. When the door closed behind her, Helen reached into a drawer and pulled out the original power of attorney documents, still folded, still bearing Aaron's neat, confident signature. She placed them on the table, then opened her laptop to check her email. One new message. Subject: Court Subpoena. Estate of Ronald Dorsey. Sender: Ramsey County Probate Court. She clicked it. The subpoena was addressed not to her, but to Aaron Dorsey. A scheduled hearing date. An order for all bank activity during the active POA window. Failure to appear would result in court sanctions. Helen leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled under her chin. The courtroom felt colder this time, not by temperature, but in tension. Even the bailiff's voice carried a sharper edge when he called the session to order. Helen sat near the front, expression still and unreadable, her binder on her lap like a quiet weapon. Her scarf was folded perfectly beneath her collar, the navy of her blazer pressed flat as slate. Across the aisle, Aaron shifted in his seat, jaw tight, fingers tapping the table's edge. He wore a darker suit than usual, maybe hoping the somber tone would camouflage the anxiety blooming at his temples. Cynthia sat beside him, eyes forward, her knuckles pale where they gripped a legal pad she hadn't written a word on. Judge Ramirez adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Aaron. Mr. Dorsey, you've received a court-ordered subpoena to account for your actions while holding power of attorney for the late Mr. Dorsey's estate. Your explanation? Aaron cleared his throat. Your Honor, my mother had just experienced a stroke. She was compromised. I acted in what I believed to be her best interest. Helen didn't flinch. I initiated account consolidations, moved partial funds to protect long-term holdings, and covered necessary costs, Aaron continued. All within what I understood to be my authority under POA. And did you seek co-signature or post-incident approval for any of those transfers? Judge Ramirez's tone was calm, but it carried steel beneath it. No, Your Honor. But at the time, did you notify your mother's estate attorney? No, Aaron admitted, his voice thinning. Ramirez turned toward Helen. Ms. Dorsey, do you have documentation of the financial activity in question? Helen stood and approached the witness stand with the same steadiness she used to cross suspension beams at site inspections 30 years ago. Her lawyer handed the clerk a thick folder, each tab color-coded and labeled. These are the bank records, Helen said evenly, pulled directly from the institutions. I did not authorize these withdrawals. In fact, I was not informed of them until I requested a forensic review 2 months ago. Judge Ramirez flipped through the documents slowly. Her brow creased. These are sizable, she said, and dated weeks after your physician cleared you to manage your own finances. Yes, Your Honor, Helen said. He moved $48,000 into an external trust without my knowledge, labeled as stabilization holdings. I was the one being stabilized. Cynthia let out a soft gasp beside Aaron. One hand came up to her mouth and her shoulders shook almost imperceptibly. She didn't make a sound, but the emotion seeped from her like a sudden leak in the room's oxygen. Aaron's eyes darted toward her, then away. I didn't, he began, but Ramirez raised a single hand. No interruptions, you've had your say. She set the documents down with care, then looked directly at Helen. I'm placing a temporary freeze on Mr. Dorsey's access to all remaining estate assets. A full audit will be conducted under court supervision. Any further financial transactions made under the power of attorney will be reviewed for potential restitution. Helen nodded once. No smile. Just a quiet, professional acceptance. Court will reconvene pending the audit's findings, Ramirez said. Until then, this matter is under review. The gavel dropped. The room emptied quickly, tension trailing like steam behind departing suits and heels. Helen didn't look back as she left, didn't glance at Aaron or Cynthia, or even her own attorney. She stepped through the courthouse doors into the waiting spring wind, her hands warm inside her coat pockets. The weight she carried wasn't gone, it had just shifted, compressed into clarity. Her phone buzzed as she reached the parking lot. From Shannon Lynn. Subject: Lease Renewal Draft, Suite 204. Attached is the new rent schedule. 40% increase, tied to renovation upgrades. Ready to send? Helen tapped the message once, then looked up at the building across the street where Aaron's office windows glinted like glass teeth under gray skies. He called at 7:12 in the morning, voice low and unnaturally polite, like someone rehearsing how to ask for mercy. "Hi, it's Aaron. I was hoping we could talk, in person, about the lease." Helen didn't reply right away. She let the silence stretch long enough for him to feel it. "I'll buy the coffee," he added, almost sheepish. She agreed, but only after checking her calendar, then pretending to check it again. They met at a corner cafe off Selby Avenue, a place with exposed brick, quiet jazz, and enough public presence to keep the conversation civil. Helen arrived 10 minutes early. She chose a seat by the window and ordered a single espresso. No cream, no sugar, no need to soften anything. Aaron arrived with snow still clinging to his cuffs. His hair was styled tighter than usual, his usual self-confidence now dulled by something sour behind the eyes. The navy suit he wore was expensive but not recent, perhaps one he hadn't worn since before the subpoena. He sat across from her and smiled. It didn't land. "Thanks for coming," he said. I know things have been tense." "Tense is a thermostat," Helen replied. "This is structural damage." Aaron winced, the smile faltering. He pulled a folder from his briefcase but left it closed. "I'm not contesting the new rate," he said, palms flat on the table. "I get it. You're the owner. You can do what you want, but it's a 40% jump. That hits hard, especially with the audit in progress. If you could just ease it a little, maybe a phased increase, I think we could get back to a better place." Helen sipped her espresso. "And what place is that?" His hands twitched slightly. "Some version of normal. Where we talk, where we don't surprise each other in courtrooms and contracts." She reached into her bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, glossy and unmistakably printed from a community center bulletin. She slid it across the table, her fingers barely brushing the edge. Aaron looked down. St. Paul Community Justice Center Spring Lecture Series, Financial Ethics and Accountability, Tuesdays at 6 p.m., public admission, free materials included. His eyebrows lifted in disbelief. "What is this?" Helen's voice was measured. "A starting point. I'm a practicing attorney. And yet, here we are." Aaron glanced around the cafe like he'd suddenly remembered they weren't alone. "I'm not taking a class at a community center," he muttered, folding the flyer too tightly, his knuckles paling. "I didn't say you had to." Helen stood, smoothed her coat. "You can keep the flyer. Or not. That's the beauty of financial freedom. Choice." He opened his mouth as if to speak again, but no words came. Just the static hum of jazz, the hiss of steamed milk, and a flyer now creased into awkward quarters on the tabletop. Helen didn't wait for him to find his footing. She turned and walked toward the door, her steps even, her exit unannounced. By the time she reached home, Grace had already texted her. "He tried the sympathy route, didn't he? This generation needs consequences, not casseroles." Helen smiled and typed only, "He got a syllabus." Later that evening, while scanning emails, one subject line caught her attention. Nomination, Women's Financial Justice Panel, Spring Session. She opened it slowly. A community liaison had read about her courtroom testimony. Word had spread. Someone had clipped her quotes from the hearing and posted them to a legal forum. The message ended with, "Your clarity under pressure inspired our advisory board. We'd be honored to have you speak." Helen sat back in her chair. She wasn't sure what surprised her more, that someone had been listening or that she didn't feel unqualified. She stared at the screen a moment longer before softly murmuring to herself, "Then let's speak." The lights were bright, but not blinding. Warm and soft, like an early evening porch glow rather than the courtroom's sterile glare. Helen sat on stage behind a folding table draped in a burgundy cloth, her name printed cleanly on a placard in front of her, Helen M. Dorsey, Financial Literacy Advocate. The room wasn't grand, just a mid-sized conference space inside the St. Paul Women's Resource Center. But it was full. Women of all ages and backgrounds sat in rows of stackable chairs, notebooks in their laps, phones recording discreetly, brows furrowed as the last panelist finished speaking about inheritance disputes and emotional leverage in blended families. When Helen's name was called, she stood slowly. No notes, no slides, just the same navy blazer she'd worn to court, the same steel in her spine. "My name is Helen Dorsey," she began, voice calm but deliberate. "My husband passed 2 years ago. I had a mild stroke shortly after. My son, a real estate attorney, used that moment to convince the court I couldn't manage the estate. He wanted power of attorney. He got it." Murmurs rippled softly through the audience. "What he didn't count on," she continued, "was that recovery sharpens certain instincts, especially the ones tied to survival, especially for women like us, who've had to sit through meetings where we weren't heard, contracts we weren't supposed to read, accounts we weren't supposed to notice." She lifted a slender black binder from her seat and held it up. Tabs jutted from the edges like a miniature skyline. "This is what I brought to court. It includes notarized cognitive assessments, a printout of every bank transfer made without my consent, and a copy of the lease agreement for the building I now own, the one where my son still pays rent." A round of applause cracked across the room. One woman shouted, "Yes!" and another elbowed her friend, pointing at the binder. Helen lowered it gently to the table. "This isn't about revenge. It's about record-keeping, paper trails, legal literacy, and the cold, clean power of ownership." The applause came louder this time. Earned, not just supportive. It didn't swell like sentiment, it struck like a gavel. Afterward, panelists gathered around to ask for copies of her binder template. One woman teared up while asking, "Could I email this to my aunt? Her son just froze her out of the family trust." "Of course," Helen said, offering her card. "Just tell her to read slowly, twice." Out in the hallway, as the crowd thinned, a woman with a press badge approached. "I'm writing for Midwest Legal Advocate. Can I ask, do you think what you did was revenge?" Helen met her gaze and didn't blink. "No," she said, "it was real estate." That night, Grace brought over a cheap bottle of wine and a box of those almond croissants Helen liked too much to admit. She walked in holding the local paper like a trophy. The article ran on page 2, title bold and unapologetic, "The Landlord Who Outmaneuvered the Law, One Woman's Guide to Paper, Power, and Patience." Helen laughed under her breath. "That's dramatic." Grace raised her glass. "It's accurate." Helen framed the clipping in a dollar store frame and hung it in the entryway, just below the thermostat. Unassuming, but visible. The next morning, an email alert popped up on her phone. One she hadn't expected. No subject, no return address, just a digital card. "Thank you for holding him accountable." See, Helen stared at the screen for a long time, her tea forgotten on the windowsill. Later that afternoon, Shannon texted her from the management office. "Just FYI, Suite 204 missed their rent payment. First time." Helen exhaled, slow and steady, as if some unspoken fuse had finally caught the flame. The email subject line was direct, merciless. "Rent unpaid. Suite 204. Shannon didn't sugarcoat anything, and Helen didn't ask her to. The PDF attached was sharper than any argument could be. Just 3 clean pages drafted with precision, each line cutting closer to inevitability. Notice to cure or quit. Non-payment of rent. Legally sound. Gracefully delivered. Irrefutable. Helen reviewed it in silence, her reading glasses catching the faint reflection of the morning sun against the kitchen window. Outside, the snow had started to melt in patches, bearing concrete beneath. Concrete always told the truth. She clicked reply. "Proceed with delivery. Certified and time-stamped. Let him read the law he's always hidden behind." An hour later, the process server left Suite 204 with a blank expression and a signed delivery receipt. Shannon forwarded it with a single line. "He didn't say a word. Just took it and closed the door." Aaron's reply came later that afternoon, longer than necessary, littered with half-explanations dressed as legalese. Unforeseen liquidity delays. Pending asset review from the court. Temporary hardship. Surely we can resolve this with family understanding. Helen didn't respond, not with text, not with a call. She printed the email, folded it neatly, and placed it under a magnet on her refrigerator labeled, "Excuses are not currency." That evening, Grace showed up with a roll of contractor-grade trash bags and a clipboard. "Here," she said, holding up a checklist labeled "Suite Prep, Tenant Exit, Trash Out, Repaint, Carpet Steam, Deep Clean Kitchenette, Replace Deadbolt." Helen took it without blinking. "You think he'll leave?" "I think you gave him 2 doors," Grace replied. "You just didn't label which one opens." Helen walked the checklist to her desk, signed the bottom, and pulled out a sticky note. She scribbled, "If he leaves, list it. If he stays, raise it." She stuck it to the top of the file folder labeled 204, Lease Action. The next morning, the lobby filled with the low hum of industrial vacuums and the scent of pine solvent. Contractors wheeled in sample tile boards and catalog binders. They weren't heading toward Aaron's office, yet. They went to the unit next door, Suite 206. Helen stood at the edge of the hallway as they pulled out ceiling panels and unboxed recessed lighting kits. "What are you doing to this unit?" one of the tenants asked, her voice curious but wary. "Upscaling," Helen replied, quietly. Word spread quickly. Nothing louder than curiosity, but it carried. Aaron didn't come down. Not that day, not the next. But someone did. At 5:52 p.m. on Thursday, just as Helen was cleaning her tea strainer, the doorbell rang. She glanced through the front window and saw a familiar silhouette standing alone on the porch, shoulders squared, coat pulled tight, heels planted not in defiance, but in decision. Cynthia. Helen opened the door but said nothing. The late daylight cast a golden line between them. Cynthia swallowed. Her voice was smaller than Helen remembered. "I came alone," she said. Helen stepped back without a word, just far enough to let her inside, but not too far. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, but rapidly forming. Cynthia entered. Her hands were empty. Her eyes were not. Cynthia didn't remove her coat when she stepped into the warmth of Helen's foyer. She just stood there, hands clasped, the collar pulled close like armor. Her eyes darted briefly to the framed article near the thermostat, the one with Helen's name in bold black print. The headline glared like a verdict. Helen gestured silently toward the living room. Cynthia followed. The house smelled faintly of lemon oil and slow-brewed tea. The kind of stillness that hangs only in places where order hasn't been disrupted, only rearranged. Helen didn't ask what Cynthia wanted. She poured 2 cups of tea, placed them on the coffee table, and sat. Cynthia didn't touch hers. "He's selling things," Cynthia began. Her voice was steady but quieter than usual. "Furniture, stock shares, even that old watch your husband left him, the one with the engraving inside." Helen stirred her tea once. "Why are you here, Cynthia?" Cynthia's hands curled around her knees. She looked down at the carpet, picking at a thread. "Because I didn't stop him," she said. "I thought if I waited long enough, he'd grow out of it." Helen gave a slow blink. "He never had to. No one made him." Cynthia's shoulders sank like someone had finally removed the last beam propping her spine. "I tried to keep the peace. That's what I told myself." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "But mostly, I didn't want to be the one who made things worse. I didn't know silence was already part of the crime." Helen leaned back slightly, but her gaze never wavered. "It usually is." Cynthia finally reached for her tea, fingers trembling against the ceramic. She didn't sip it, just held it like a confession. "He's in over his head," she said. "Between the court and the audit and the lease, he doesn't know what to do." Helen lifted an eyebrow. "That's between him and his calendar." There was a pause, heavy and final, but not angry. Cynthia pulled a small box from her coat pocket and placed it gently on the coffee table between them. Cardboard, worn at the edges, secured with blue painter's tape. "He had these in a drawer. I don't think he meant to keep them from you. I think he just didn't know what they meant." Helen opened the box slowly. Inside were 3 brass nameplates from old project sites, a crumpled program from a city bridge dedication, and a small glass award etched with her name. Helen M. Dorsey, Structural Integrity Pioneer, 1994. Her fingertips brushed the edge of it. She didn't lift it out. Not yet. "I kept meaning to give them back," Cynthia said. "I don't know why it took this long." Helen studied her. "Yes, you do." Cynthia nodded, eyes glassy. "I didn't want to admit who I married." Helen didn't answer. She didn't need to. The doorbell rang just as Cynthia stood to leave. Neither woman flinched. Helen walked her to the door, opened it without ceremony. Cynthia hesitated on the porch. "I'm sorry, for all of it." Helen held her gaze. "Live like it." And then Cynthia was gone, swallowed by the fading light and the hum of a street lamp kicking on. Back inside, Helen set the box down on the mantel and looked at it a long time, her tea going cold beside her. Her phone buzzed. Incoming call. Shannon Lynn. Helen answered. "I've got something for you," Shannon said, tone clipped but bright. "We just got a new tenant offer for Suite 204. It's 12% higher than what Aaron's paying, and they want a 5-year lease." Helen didn't speak. She just walked to the window and looked out at the darkening skyline, one hand resting on the box of old accomplishments her son never once asked her about. The papers sat on Helen's desk for precisely 1 hour and 7 minutes before she signed them, not out of hesitation, but out of ritual. She wanted the moment to mean something, not vengeance, not spite, just closure you could hold in your hands. The form was crisp, fresh from the printer. Across the top in bold sans serif font, notice of lease termination, Suite 204, effective date, 60 days from filing. Reason, non-payment and failure to cure within the allotted legal period. Helen signed it with her blue ink pen, the same one she'd used for every significant signature in her adult life, from engineering contracts to estate responses. She pressed harder than she needed to, not out of anger, for clarity. By noon, Shannon had the notice submitted, time-stamped, and backed up to 3 servers. "Want me to post the vacancy online now?" Shannon asked over the phone. "Yes," Helen said. "Let the market speak." The listing went live at 2:12 p.m. By Friday morning, they had 2 offers. One was from a small family-run financial planning firm. Respectable, neutral, quiet. The other, a nonprofit mental health practice. Helen raised an eyebrow when Shannon said the name aloud, Bridgeview Counseling Collective. "They specialize in trauma-informed care," Shannon added. "An interesting fit for the space, given the history," Helen finished for her. "Yes, fitting, isn't it?" By Friday afternoon, the lease was in draft form, 5-year term, market rate, 2-month build-out window, no red flags, no tricks, just progress. Helen didn't tell Aaron. She didn't need to. The following week, she and Grace stood in the break room of the now-vacant Suite 204, a place that already felt like it belonged to someone else. The contractors had stripped the walls of their generic art prints. The blinds had been pulled. The silence felt less like a void and more like a reset. They each had a small bowl of pistachio ice cream from the deli across the street, the kind with actual crushed nuts and just enough sweetness to say you're allowed to enjoy this. Grace leaned against the window ledge. "You ever think it'd go this far?" Helen nodded once. "I just never thought I'd be the one holding the pen." They ate in silence for a while. The sun poured in across the laminate tile and bounced off the new nameplate resting on the desk. Temporary but already claimed, Bridgeview Counseling, opening soon. Helen pulled a pamphlet from her bag. It was from a small legal aid organization she'd quietly started supporting after the second hearing, focused entirely on elderly exploitation and estate abuse. They had a waiting list of clients, mostly women, most of them alone. "I'm going to double the donation," she said aloud. Grace smiled behind her spoon. "Call it a rent redistribution." Later that evening, Helen sat in her office at home, her late husband's watch ticking softly in the drawer beside her. She didn't open it. She didn't need to anymore. The house was quiet, intentional. At exactly 6:48 p.m., her doorbell rang. She didn't answer it right away. She knew what it was. By the time she reached the window, she saw him. Aaron. No truck, no moving company. Just him, alone, carrying one box down the front steps of Suite 204. He didn't look up. He didn't linger. Box by box, across 2 evenings, he emptied his office. No goodbyes, no standoff, just the slow extraction of a presence that had overstayed its lease, figuratively and legally. Helen watched until the lights inside went out, and then, only then, did she close the blinds. Next day, Helen found the office key in a plain envelope. It arrived in silence. No knock, no car in the driveway, just a plain white envelope resting squarely on the welcome mat, angled too precisely to be mistaken for junk mail or a flyer. The wind hadn't nudged it. No footprints marked the frost on the steps. Helen spotted it from the kitchen window as she sipped her morning tea. Something about the shape, flat, sealed, intentionally blank, made her set her cup down before it was empty. She opened the door without rushing. No neighbors in sight, just the envelope, sealed with a single strip of Scotch tape. No name, no return address. Inside was one brass office key. Nothing else. She stared at it for a moment, then turned it over in her palm once. The metal was still warm. No note, no apology, not even the decency of a period at the end of this particular sentence. Helen closed the door, dropped the envelope on the sideboard, and walked straight to her desk. She pulled out the building file and texted Shannon. Change the locks. Full set. Suite 204 first. Shannon's reply came 30 seconds later. Already scheduled. Locksmiths on site by 10. That afternoon, the new tenant from Bridgeview Counseling stopped by with a small bouquet, white lilies and soft lavender, tied with jute string and a handwritten tag. Helen answered in her slippers. "We just wanted to say thank you," the woman said, smiling gently, "for giving us the space. It feels safe here." Helen didn't smile back, not right away, but she nodded once. That was enough. "You've got good windows," she said. "Let the light in." The woman looked around. "We've already had a few walk-ins. Older folks. Said they passed the sign and decided to come inside." Helen's gaze drifted to the hallway behind her, where one of her old engineering awards now hung, not framed for pride, but placement. Quiet reminder. This building had once been taken from her. Now she chose who walked through it. That Sunday, she hosted her first legal literacy workshop in the shared conference space on the second floor. 12 women showed up, ranging from sharp-tongued retired nurses to a soft-spoken widow who still carried her deed in a Ziploc bag. Helen passed out highlighters and stapled packets. She didn't raise her voice once. "Most documents aren't meant to be understood," she said. "They're meant to exhaust you. Don't let them." Someone asked if she'd ever faced legal manipulation herself. Helen looked up and replied, "I once owned half of something. Then I bought the whole thing." The room burst into quiet laughter, half awe, half solidarity. Later that week, an envelope arrived in the mail. No postmark, no barcode, hand-addressed. Inside was a folded card from Judge Ramirez. Heavy stock, ink you could feel. "Some fights are worth taking slowly. You did more than defend your rights. You made space for others to find theirs." R.R. Helen read it once, then tucked it into the binder labeled Workshop Materials. Volume 1. She didn't tell Grace about it. She didn't need to. Grace would see it the next time she helped staple packets. By Friday, as the sun began to stretch longer across the office lobby floors, Shannon called. "I know we're settled, but I have to ask," she said. "We've had 2 more property owners inquire if HDR Holdings is expanding." Helen raised an eyebrow. She leaned back in her chair, glancing at the framed headline on her office wall. "The landlord who outmaneuvered the law." "Are you asking if I want to expand my portfolio?" she asked. Shannon hesitated. "Exactly that." Helen didn't answer right away. She simply looked out the window, where a former tenant once walked past her without remorse and now wouldn't even cross the same threshold. The for sale sign came down just after sunrise. Helen stood on the sidewalk, coat buttoned to the collar, the breath in her lungs fogging gently in the early spring chill. Across from her, the freshly purchased cafe sat modestly on the corner. Quaint brick, once forgotten trim, faded green awning. A new lock clicked into place. It had been listed as a fixer-upper. She saw it as a statement piece. The purchase closed under HDR Holdings, of course. Quiet as a whisper, just like the first time, but this one wasn't about leasing space. It was about anchoring the block. Aaron had tried to build himself into this city's landscape. Helen was becoming part of its foundation. She'd never been interested in coffee shops, but she knew margins, traffic patterns, and footfall better than most franchise consultants. Her cafe wouldn't be trendy. It would be stable, predictable. Heron Grace showed up the next day with her sleeves rolled and a mop in hand. "Name it yet?" she asked, dipping the mop head into the bucket. Helen stood behind the counter, checking invoices on her tablet. "Not yet. Feels too early." Grace grinned. "What about Second Wind? Or maybe Dorsey Grounds?" Helen looked up. "I'm not building a pun. I'm building equity." By the end of the week, the tenant board at the original office complex had been updated. New paint, new frames. Suite 204 now read Bridgeview Counseling Collective. The hallway smelled of fresh plaster and peppermint cleaner. Sunlight broke through the window where Aaron's blinds used to hang crooked. Helen walked those halls with measured steps, clipboard in hand, not checking, overseeing. She'd never worn a hard hat here, but in a way, everything she'd built was still structural. That Friday morning, she sat at a small corner table inside the new cafe, sipping black tea from a ceramic mug. Through the wide storefront glass, the city moved on. At 8:37 a.m., a familiar figure crossed the street toward the meter. Dark wool coat, slumped shoulders, a messenger bag that now sagged where it once strutted. Aaron. He fed coins into the parking meter across from her window. When he looked up, he froze. They locked eyes through the glass. No hostility, no drama. Just two people divided by actions and the aftermath. He offered a small nod. Almost respectful. Cautious. Helen nodded back. She didn't stand. He didn't wave. And then he turned, disappearing down the sidewalk, swallowed by morning foot traffic and gray slush at the curb. Helen returned to her tea. Later that afternoon, the contractors hung the final brass plaque above the main building's front entrance. It was modest, tastefully matte, the lettering clean and straight. Dorsey Office Commons in honor of reclamation. Shannon sent a photo to Helen's phone before she even got back from the cafe. It's up, and it looks like it's been there forever. Helen smiled faintly, not because it had been easy, but because permanence is earned. By the following week, a legal blog picked up her story from a workshop attendee's tweet. Then another outlet followed. Then a podcast called Elder Power, Real Property reached out. Within days, inboxes were flooded with speaking requests, interview offers, even a book inquiry. But Helen wasn't interested in memoirs. She was interested in blueprints. A woman from Michigan messaged her to ask for lease negotiation tips. A couple in Nebraska sent flowers to her office with a note, "You gave us the courage to remove our son from our will." Thank you, Helen forwarded those to Grace. The city never gave her a parade. But by month's end, the block knew her name. One morning, while locking up after a financial literacy seminar, Helen spotted Aaron again, this time standing at the cafe's curb. He didn't enter, just lingered long enough to show he saw her. Then he raised his hand slightly, in greeting. "Morning, ma'am," he said. She nodded through the glass but didn't speak, not out of cruelty, out of closure.